nobles tended to justify their grip on the armed forces by arguing that their order existed to fight. And this argument served to defend their tax exemptions as well. It went back to the classic medieval division of society into those who worked, those who fought, and those who prayed. Naturally, those who prayed, the clergy, invoked similar arguments, for the same functional principle underlay the extensive privileges which they enjoyed. 2. In law, the clergy ranked ahead of the nobility as the first order of the realm, for they were the custodians of the community's spiritual welfare and its moral standards. They numbered about 130,000, but over half were in regular orders, 2/3 of them women, and many of the seculars were canons without cure of souls, as members of 496 cathedral or collegiate chapters. Parish priests, therefore, were in a minority, and their distribution across the country averaged one for every 400 or 500 inhabitants. But the clerical presence, like everything else in the kingdom, was unevenly distributed. In the countryside, the curé was often the only ecclesiastic his parishioners ever came across, whereas townscapes were dominated by convents, seminaries, schools, and hospitals, all run by clerics, not to mention cathedrals, collegiate churches, and innumerable parish churches within sight of one another and within sound of each other's bells. In many a small town, the church was the chief source of employment. In Chartres, the cathedral chapter alone gave direct employment to 500 or 600 of the 12,000 inhabitants, and was the main source of business for many more. The money thus spent came from over 17,000 acres and 124 feudal lordships in the surrounding district. In Bayeux, a town of 10,000, it was estimated that the total annual contribution of all ecclesiastical institutions to the town's economy was worth 400,000 livres. Over France as a whole, about a tenth of the land was in the hands of the church, although much more in the north than the south. And in the form of the tithe, the parish clergy were theoretically entitled to a tenth of every person's livelihood for their upkeep. In practice, the tithe was far more patchily levied, and seldom took as much as a tenth even from those who failed to avoid it. But with the exception of provinces added to the kingdom since 1561, and thereby reputed foreign, all these ecclesiastical revenues were exempt from ordinary taxation. Unlike the nobility, the clergy had consistently fought off every attempt by the government to breach this principle. The most recent battle had occurred between 1749 and 1751, when the Vantium had been introduced. The clergy won it because they were well organized. Unlike the second or third estates, they had a representative general assembly which convened every 5 years. When it was not in session, the collective affairs of the order were managed by a permanent general agency, headed by 2 carefully chosen agents general. Ambitious young priests with names to make. Most of their business was financial, since exemption from taxation did not mean that the clergy contributed nothing to the royal revenues. Every 10 years, a free gift was negotiated, made up by an internal levy on clerical income. Further sums were raised to pay interest on extensive loans, which the clergy used its superior credit to float on the state's behalf. Altogether, the clergy paid out about 16 millions annually to or for the state. But since they had revenues of perhaps $250 million, the proportion of their income was nowhere near that demanded of the laity. Nor was the weight of clerical taxation equitably distributed within the order. The parish clergy, dependent on tithes, fees, and if they were lucky, a little glebe land, paid almost half the total raised, yet had little say in its allocation within each diocese. Positions of power or influence in the hierarchy were monopolized by canons and other representatives of the great chapters and monasteries who owned most of the church's landed wealth. And the richest of these corporations, in turn, were invariably dominated by the nobility, who saw in them an important, comfortable, and well-paid refuge over numerous sons and daughters otherwise burdensome to family fortunes. Ever since the Concordat of 1516 between Francis I and Pope Leo X, the king had appointed all bishops and the abbots of greater monasteries. In the 18th century, he distributed this huge fund of patronage on the advice of a bishop entrusted with what was known as the Benefice Portfolio, Fuil de Benefice. None of its holders, however, proved able to resist the enormous pressure they were subjected to by courtier families anxious to place their members, friends, and dependents in lucrative clerical comfort. The rise in landed revenues over the century only increased in the demand. The greater archbishops all enjoyed six-figure incomes, and very few prelates brought in less than 20,000 livres. A commendatory abbot of one of the greater monasteries might draw more than many a bishop. Accordingly, most of these much sought after benefices went to younger sons of the greater nobility. In 1789, the entire episcopate, bar one, was of noble birth, and a quarter of all sees were in the hands of just 13 families. Many of the beneficiaries of this system were appointed very young after truncated studies, lightning ordination, and rapid progress through a hierarchy of lesser dignities. Talleyrand, condemned to a clerical rather than a military career by an accident in infancy which stunted one of his legs, was ordained a subdeacon at 21. Canon of Reims within weeks, and abbot within months, yet did not become a priest until 4 years later. Another year saw him one of the two agents general of the clergy, and at 34, in 1788, he was Bishop of Autun. Few of Louis XVI's bishops were as cynical and cold-blooded as Talleyrand was to prove, and most were to stand by their vocation with more or less zeal when it was put to the test. But they had all climbed the ladder of preferment in the same way, for there was no other. And if such a system produced tepid pastors, it made the bishops of the Gallican Church formidable politicians and power brokers. When Loménie de Brienne, Archbishop of Toulouse, became chief minister in May 1787, it was the fulfillment of an ambition openly pursued for years. The examples earlier in the century of Fleury, Bernice, and Terray showed that Louis XVI's principle of never giving high secular office to clerics had died with him. Brienne had made his name as a church reformer. In 1766, he had been made chairman of the commission of regulars established by the assembly of the clergy to investigate and, if necessary, close or amalgamate under occupied monasteries or convents. This reforming gesture was undertaken in the aftermath of the greatest religious upheaval of the century. The expulsion of the Jesuits from the kingdom in 1764, resulting in many ways from a string of improbable accidents. This removal by the secular power of one of the most vigorous and influential orders in French religious and educational life, nevertheless, vividly demonstrated how vulnerable a church that refused to reform itself might be. Reading these warning signs, the church looked around for soft targets. Contemplative orders faltering in their recruitment and condemned by an increasingly utilitarian public opinion as useless hoarders of wealth and bolt holes for idlers, were obviously in an exposed position. Between 1768 and 1780, accordingly, 458 smaller monasteries were dissolved. Their capital assets, estimated at 642,029 livres, were redistributed to hospitals, poor houses, and seminaries. But larger, richer houses continued unscathed, and nothing was done about the problems of the parish clergy. The church's undervalued, underprivileged workhorses. Few parish priests came from really poor backgrounds. The costs of acquiring the education necessary for the priesthood alone ensured that. Nor could the majority of beneficed parish priests be considered poverty-stricken by the standards of most of the population. But many resented the inequitable distribution of the church's wealth, their exclusion from any say in how the church was governed, and the complete absence of promotion prospects. Improving agricultural prices brought growing prosperity to those who enjoyed tithes. But in many towns, tithes were a thing of the past. And even in the country, about a third of the beneficed clergy had no right to their parish tithes. They had been impropriated, sometimes by laymen, but more often by monasteries or other ecclesiastical corporations, who only paid the incumbent a fixed share of the yield known as the portion congrue. The inflation of the century constantly eroded the value of what was in effect a salary, and in 1768 and again in 1786, royal edicts imposed rises. Both occasions they were denounced as inadequate. Yet, rather than pay them, many tithe owners abandoned their rights to incumbents. Now it was their turn to incur the odium of tithe collection and to find that the yield was often less than that of the congru. In the 1770s, the discontents of the parish clergy erupted in many dioceses in the form of mutinous assemblies which denounced the inadequacies of the congru, the unfairness of clerical taxation, domination of diocesan administration by canons and regulars, and the despotism of bishops, whose authority stood behind so many of these practices. The bishop's response in the Assembly of the Clergy of 1780 was to reiterate long-standing prohibitions on unauthorized clerical gatherings. Their stance was reinforced by a royal edict of 1782, which apparently brought an end to the so-called revolt of the cures. It did nothing to tackle its causes, however, at a time when the church was under unprecedented attack from critical laymen. Nothing infuriated the church's critics more than its political power. It held a monopoly of public worship, and all the king's subjects were legally Catholics. Protestants enjoyed no legal toleration, except in Alsace, and no civil rights. As recently as 1762, a pastor had been executed, and the last Protestant galley slaves were released only in 1775. The church controlled almost the entire educational system and the bulk of poor relief and hospital provision. It had extensive powers of censorship, and the pulpit was used constantly by the secular authorities for important public announcements and warnings. All this reinforced the unique God-given moral authority to which the church laid claim. Its importance in keeping the king's subjects docile and obedient was incalculable in a country where the everyday forces of law and order were very thinly stretched. Apart from the army, law enforcement throughout most of the kingdom was in the hands of the Maréchaussée, a mounted police force, barely 3,000 strong. Additionally, all towns of any size were employed watchmen, but even in the largest, their complement seldom ran to 3 figures. Only Paris was considered well policed, with almost 2,000 officers serving a variety of agencies in addition to the French and Swiss guards. France, in fact, had far more magistrates than policemen. Their numbers swelled by the sale of offices in earlier centuries. At the lowest level were thousands of petty jurisdictions, many private, but all fully staffed by a complement of judges, clerks, procurators, ushers, and tipstaffs. Angers alone, a city of 26,000 inhabitants, had 53 different courts or tribunals, none of them near the top of the judicial hierarchy. Besançon, somewhat larger but with a parliament, had a legal population of around 500, which meant almost 1/12 of the population probably depended directly on the law for their existence, and many more indirectly. The delays and costs of this judicial labyrinth were notorious. "Do we not see every day," noted the Procurator General of the Parliament of Paris, who ought to have known in 1763, "people obliged to go to law over 2 or 3 years, and at great cost to find out which judges they will have the misfortune to appear before." Yet, so long as France lacked a uniform set of laws and the government felt unable to buy out venal office holders, the problem seemed insoluble. Such reforms and rationalizations as did occur between 1771 and 1774, or again in 1788, were fragmentary, came as byproducts of political conflict between the government and the parliaments, and proved as transient as the circumstances that had facilitated them. The parliaments sat at the summit of the judicial hierarchy, the supreme and final courts of appeal for their own regions. They also enjoyed extensive administrative powers, which brought them into regular conflict with governors and intendants. Above all, they had a crucial role in the legislative process. All laws, to be valid, needed to be registered in their records, and they had the right to point out any defects in new legislation by sending the king remonstrances. By deferring registration pending the king's reply, they were able to delay and obstruct government policy. And since the death of Louis XIV, they had developed this technique into a major vehicle of opposition. Strictly speaking, remonstrances were confidential communications between the king and his courts. But over the same period, it had become normal for parliaments to marshal public opinion on their side by printing and selling them. Often they would renew remonstrances after the king's reply, and later in the century they extended their means of resistance to judicial strikes and occasional mass resignations. Everyone knew, however, that ultimately the king had the last word. He could silence all opposition by coming in person, or in the provinces sending a personal representative to the court and dictating registration of the contentious measures in a session known as Alit de Justice. In the presence of the monarch, the font of justice, the delegated authority of his magistrates was nullified. Parliaments usually protested at such displays of sovereignty, but they seldom continued to resist after them. Honor was satisfied, and beyond lay outright rebellion, which none of them was prepared to contemplate. Nor did most contentious issues need the extreme response of a lit de justice to resolve them. The exceptions were matters of religion and finance. Even here, the expulsion of the Jesuits in the 1760s, which they largely brought about, marked the end, as well as the high point, of the Parliament's interference in religious questions. Financial confrontations, however, could only get worse in an age of ever-spiraling military expenditure and constant attempts to increase taxes and borrowing to meet it. In the first half of the century, the Parliament of Paris, by far the most important sovereign court, with a jurisdiction covering a third of France, spoke out almost alone on such matters. But from the introduction of the 20e in 1749, the provincial courts also began to assert themselves, both on financial matters and against what they saw as the attempts of agents of central government in the provinces to extend their own authority. The 1760s were particularly stormy, witnessing serious clashes with the parliaments of Besançon, Toulouse, Bordeaux, Pau, and Rennes, and periodic lesser confrontations with others too. The suspicion grew that the sovereign courts were acting in secret concert to discredit and usurp royal power. And in 1766, Louis XV felt obliged to reassert his absolute and unlimited authority in blunt terms. in what those present remembered as a scourging session. The king came in person to the Parliament of Paris and declared that it is in my person alone that sovereign power resides. It is from me alone that my courts derive their authority, and the plenitude of this authority, which they exercise only in my name, remains always in me. It is to me alone that legislative power belongs, without any dependence and without any division. The whole public order emanates from me, and the rights and interests of the nation are necessarily joined with mine and rest only in my hands. But clashes continued, as it proved impossible in peacetime to reduce the burden of taxes first justified by the demands of mid-century wars. In 1771, they reached a further climax when a new chancellor, Maupeou, provoked the Parliament of Paris into refusing all cooperation. Maupeou reacted by exiling its magistrates and replacing them with more docile collaborators. He also took the opportunity to abolish venality of offices in the Parliament and set up a new structure of subordinate courts throughout the Parliament's resort. When the provincial parliaments protested, they too were remodeled. Surprising numbers of existing magistrates cooperated in this operation, but those who suffered exile and dispossession raised a huge clamor at what they claimed was the overthrow of the kingdom's constitution. The king was deluged with remonstrances before the courts were silenced by the reform. And despite a carefully orchestrated propaganda campaign, the government was unable to convince the bulk of public opinion of the value of what it had done. The new system had still put down no deep roots when, 3 years after its introduction, Louis XV died. What to do about the parliaments was therefore the first major political decision faced by Louis XVI on his accession. Within months, he decided to restore them. Maupeou was dismissed, and all his innovations abandoned. The new monarch's most influential ministers had persuaded him that public opinion would have no faith in his good intentions if he did not bring back the tried and trusted defenders of public liberties. And so, by the time of the coronation, the old judiciary had been reintegrated, venality restored, and the Parliament of Paris was once again remonstrating and obstructing the registration of new laws. But those who thought nothing had changed were wrong. The parliaments had been shown that they were not invulnerable, and the public had been shown what feeble cheeks on a determined government they were. The Parliament of Paris, having proved to its own satisfaction by its remonstrances of 1775 and 1776, that it was formidable as ever, lapsed into a relative quiescence that lasted a decade. Several of its provincial counterparts were torn for years by unseemingly internal recriminations between magistrates who had cooperated with Maupeou and those who had not. The Chancellor, France's last, since he refused to resign on dismissal and only died in 1792, had shattered the Parliament's political credibility, and even their complete restoration was unable to rebuild it. Nor did the damage end there. The crown, too, was indelibly tainted by the memory of Maupeou. Louis XV's willingness to tolerate a measure of defiance from his sovereign courts, despite the extreme claims he had made for his own authority in 1766, had marked the French monarchy out as a law-abiding and receptive to the legitimate expression of the subjects' discontents. The parliaments enjoyed considerable popular support, and the king's occasional concessions to their opposition served to reassure his subjects that he was no tyrant. Maupeou, supported by a monarch now aging and tired of endless obstruction, swept this subtle structure of confidence away. His attack on courts of law, which traced their origins and powers almost as far back as the monarchy itself, showed him up as the agent of despotism, of government by no law except the monarch's will, where no person and no property was secure against his whims. If Louis XVI had kept Maupeou in power and preserved his reforms, he would have been called a tyrant 17 years before he was. But even the restoration of the former parliaments could not efface the memory of their suppression. Frenchmen now knew what power their king might deploy if he had a mind to, and few of them found much comfort in the knowledge. The institutions and the men of before 1771 were brought back, but the atmosphere of political confidence, innocence even, in which they had operated was irrecoverable. The magistrates of the parliaments numbered around 1,200, together with perhaps 1,000 more officers in other sovereign courts, mainly exercising special financial and fiscal jurisdiction. They made up the nobility of the robe. All sovereign court offices ennobled, but few members of the parliaments by now owed their nobility to their offices. Mostly they had several generations of noble forebears behind them. And by this time, a number of parliaments had decided to admit nobody without such credentials. In their provinces, these men dominated all local affairs, which was why they so often came into conflict with intendants and governors. In Paris, they dominated national affairs. Not only did the Parliament and certain other metropolitan sovereign courts enjoy wider powers and jurisdiction than their provincial counterparts. The Parisian robe nobility also provided most of those who went on to become intendants, counselors of state, and ministers. After a few years on the bench, young magistrates of ambition would seek to buy one of the 80 offices of Master of Requests. By shining there, they could legitimately hope to be appointed to one of the 34 intendancies, which were always filled from their ranks, and whereas most intendants never ended up as ministers, many ministers had served their time as intendants. All this meant that the worlds of government and the law in the capital were closely linked, and the intermarriage common in these circles made the relationship yet closer. Everybody involved in political conflicts had relatives on both sides, and the great confrontations were not always as serious as they appeared. Knowing each other intimately, those involved realized that their opponents had appearances to maintain. Maupeou himself, recently first president of the Paris Parliament, shocked this cozy world when he exiled the most vocal of his former colleagues to places seemingly chosen for their discomfort. No wonder he aroused such personal hatred, and when, to fill up the posts in his new system, he brought in outsiders, intruders as they were known, he only compounded the insult. The narrow legal and administrative elite who controlled most of the levers of power in the kingdom did not welcome new blood, and even members of the provincial robe only broke in occasionally. Only two other groups enjoyed as much say in the government of the kingdom, and one of these had only attained complete respectability within living memory. This group was that of the financiers, or finance as contemporaries called it. Numbering no more than 200 or 300 individuals, it kept the government solvent by handling its revenues and outgoings, providing short-term credit, and raising longer-term loans from contacts in the private world of banking and trade. Most of the indirect taxes were collected by the Farmers General, a rich syndicate who leased the monopoly under a contract renewed every 6 years. Revenue from direct taxes was received and paid out by venal office holders who were also financiers. They made their living from handling public funds, and the spectacular profits of this activity placed them among the king's richest subjects. Few of them were far more from humble mercantile beginnings, but few omitted either to buy themselves ennoblement, and their daughters were among the most prized heiresses in the kingdom. They lived in ostentatious luxury, and the fact that this dazzling wealth came from public resources created the suspicion that it had been made at public expense. So financiers were widely hated. Old nobles regarded them as jumped up, although they were eager enough to regild their arms with their daughters' dowries. Professional men thought the same, while envying their success, and taxpayers considered them public blood suckers. Regretting the days, still just within living memory, when financiers were put on trial for embezzlement whenever a new reign began. In 1774, there was no question of that. They were now too influential. Attempts were made by successive finance ministers during the decade to eliminate some of the offices through which financiers operated, but in 1781 these efforts were abandoned. 4 years later, the Farmers General began to build a new 10-foot high wall around Paris to prevent evasion of entry tolls. The gates or barriers they commissioned were severe masterpieces of modern design. To ordinary Parisians, however, they were hated symbols of fiscal oppression and misapplication of the king's revenues. To find a really staggering example of extravagance at the taxpayer's expense, however, it was necessary to travel 12 miles to the west, to Versailles. Here was the seat of the royal court and of the courtiers, who constituted the third key power group within the French body politic. 50,000 people lived in Versailles, making it France's 10th largest town. 10,000 of them lived or worked in the palace, the king's household, and the whole life of the town depended on it. 35 million livres, or about 5% of the king's annual revenue, were spent on the court. And most of this outlay ended up in the pockets of a few hundred courtiers. Anybody who was decently dressed could enter the palace of Versailles. It is impossible, marveled Arthur Young, not to like this careless indifference and freedom from suspicion. But only those who had been presented to the king and hunted with him were true courtiers. And to be admitted to these honors of the court, one had to have authentic proofs of noble ancestry, reaching back to 1400, or enjoy exemption by special favor. Less than 1,000 families had this distinction, and many of those took no advantage of it after presentation, since life at Versailles was ruinously expensive. Only the richest could afford the clothes, the retinue, the entertaining, and the upkeep of quarters, both there and in Paris, that were essential to lead the life of high fashion. Those who could afford it were the kingdom's uncontested social elite, the cream of the nobility, dukes, peers, and other holders of exalted titles, great officers of the crown, ministers, generals, and archbishops, or simply favorites of the monarch or his consort. And most of them would still have found it difficult without further pensions, sinecures, and other lucrative orders and distinctions in the gift of the king. This was entirely as Louis XIV, the architect of the whole system, had intended. His aim had been to assemble the great of the kingdom around his person, where he could see and control them. Those who came were richly rewarded, and thereby domesticated and made dependent. All Louis XIV denied them was real power in the form of high political office. But by Louis XVI's time, courtiers had reconquered even that. From the late 1750s, dukes and peers were found holding ministerial portfolios alongside the professionals of the robe. And even without formally holding office, people who mingled daily with the king, his ministers, and favorites could hardly fail to be influential. Life at court was in fact an endless pursuit of advantage, status, pensions, offices, and perquisites from those whom royal favor endowed with power to bestow them. News of the death of Louis XV came to his successor, Marie Antoinette's first lady of the bedchamber recalled, when a terrible noise exactly like thunder was heard in the outer room of his apartments. It was the crowd of courtiers deserting the antechamber of the dead sovereign, to come and greet the new power of Louis XV. Such graphic recollections fill the pages of countless diarists and memorialists who chronicled the intrigues of the court in loving detail from the time of Louis XV onwards. Most of them sound astonishingly trivial, but the prestige, wealth, and power they were about were real enough. France was ruled from Versailles, and the rewards of success at court were limitless. Some measured it by the public money they were able to amass. At the height of their influence in the 1780s, the family of the Duchess de Polignac, the Queen's closest friend, were together drawing an annual 438,000 livres in pensions and salaries. When she retired from court in 1774, on the death of her royal lover, Monsieur du Barry, who had started out in life as a penniless but stunningly pretty milliner, sold her three houses in Versailles, but eventually went to live on a generous pension in a lavishly furnished country house a few miles away, owning a fortune in jewels. Under the lascivious Louis XV, indeed, royal mistresses could make or break ministers. The Duc de Choiseul, greatest of his servants, reached the highest office by persistent cultivation of Mademoiselle de Pompadour. Count de Maurepas, Secretary of State for the Navy, was disgraced and exiled in 1749 for circulating smutty verses about her. He remained in exile until 1774, when a new king, who was not interested in mistresses, plucked him out of oblivion to make him his chief minister and advisor, until he died in 1781. Maurepas had a hand in the appointment and dismissal of every holder of the 4 secretaryships of state: foreign affairs, war, the navy, and the royal household. The offices of Comptroller General of the Finances and the Keeper of the Seals, head of the Judiciary, and all other places of importance, such as intendancies and the Paris Lieutenancy of Police. As the principal minister of state, with a seat on the most important of the royal councils, he had a predominant voice in all policy making, and the young monarch gladly yielded to his knowledge and experience, even though it had been gained more than a generation previously, when the problems facing the government had been far less acute. But who else could he turn to? His parents were long dead, and his grandfather, Louis XV, had done little to initiate him into the duties and mysteries of kingship. He was just 20 when he inherited the throne. His wife, who had been 15 when she had married him in 1770, had been born an Archduchess of Austria. But she was still a girl who thought of little but pleasure, and she resented his disinclination to perform his husbandly duties. He had been carefully educated, read several languages, and was conventionally devout. He had a strong sense of duty and was determined to rule well. That was why he recalled Maropa, of whom his old tutor had always spoken highly. But his podgy appearance and waddling gait were unimpressive. "The king looks," sneered an English nobleman in 1780, "much like a castrato." And the attack of smallpox, which unexpectedly carried off Louis XV, left his heir feeling, as he put it, as if the universe were falling on him. He came to the throne. He wailed, "Too young." There was nothing like the effortless assumption of authority and clear plan of action shown by the 22-year-old Louis XIV 114 years beforehand. On the day Mazarin died, all Louis XVI had was good intentions. "His Majesty wishes to place himself out of the reach of all intrigue," observed the British ambassador. "This, however, is a vain expectation, and the chimera of a young, inexperienced mind. The throne he fills, far from raising him above intrigue, places him in the center of it. Great and eminent superiority of talents might, indeed, crush these cabals, but as there is no reason to believe him possessed of that superiority, I think he will be a prey to them and find himself more and more entangled every day."